Good morning. The scripture reading today is taken from the book of Luke, chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. It's on page 1595 in your Pew Bible if you wish to follow. Hear these words. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." And Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to them, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." The devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered, "It is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test." When the devil had finished all this tempting, he left him until an opportune time. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Don. Yesterday when I was talking to she was a physician's assistant that was taking care of me, I mentioned, as I said, that I really had to function today because I was a preacher. And she said, "Couldn't they at least give you 24 hours off?" And I said, "Well, they could, but not this 24 hours. Maybe Monday they could give me off, but not Sunday." And then I was quite surprised when she said, "Well, what is your message going to be about?" It's like, whoa, I never had anyone outside the church ever asked me that question before. And I said, well, ironically or kind of funny, we're going to be talking about the temptations of Jesus. And she says, "Well, what's funny about that?" And I said, "Well, usually that's reserved for Lent. But this is the first Sunday, really, of the new year. But more importantly for us, I mentioned to her that we are beginning, I have not said it before, but we're beginning a new series of messages drawn from the Gospel of Luke. I don't know if you paid any attention, but throughout almost all of the month of November, and then on in through Advent, all of our scriptures for Sunday mornings were taken from the Gospel of Luke. The guy has a method to his madness. But today we are really beginning in earnest, working our way through, not systematically, not every chapter, every verse, but just selected passages through the Gospel of Luke between now and Easter Sunday morning. So if you're looking for some place to read in your personal devotional readings, you say, "I don't know where to go," let me point you to the Gospel of Luke perhaps for the next, 2.5 months or so. Might be a good place to look. So we are beginning with the temptations of Jesus, chapter 4. In the 19th century, when the builders of the Intercontinental Railroad, the group that started on the east side from Omaha, Nebraska, and started working their way west, when they got to, sort of East Wyoming, again, talking directions here, just a little bit west of Cheyenne in the southeast corner of the state of Wyoming, they ran into Dale Creek. Dale Creek. And they discovered a long expanse and a deep canyon to where the river was, and they simply just had to go right straight over the top of it. And so they built what at that point in time was the highest and the longest railroad trestle that had ever been constructed in the United States up to that point in time. The story is told that when the trestle was completed, when the bridge was completed, the builders ordered that a train be prepared with cars and loaded with freight sufficient enough that it represented what they estimated was 2 times the maximum load that that bridge would ever have to bear for the rest of its life. And they pulled that train out into the middle of the trestle and let it sit there for 24 hours to see what happened. Well, one of the guys who was one of the workers that helped build that thing with his sweat and his blood and his hard labor was concerned. And he went to one of the supervisors and said, "What are they trying to do? Are they trying to tear this thing down? Are they trying to break this thing down?" And the railroad official said, "No, we're trying to prove that the bridge won't break. We're trying to prove the bridge won't break." That sort of identifies the challenge, the difficulty when we start thinking about the subject of temptations. We think of temptations as something that will seduce us toward doing evil. Seduce us toward doing evil. You know, we talk about being tempted to sin. But the Bible makes it clear that that's not really all that there is. That temptation can also be understood as a time of testing. A time of testing. James said, don't let anyone say that God is tempting me. He said, we're being tempted by our own desires, our own lusts, and we're being tempted by the devil. But God does allow times of testing. He himself, in Genesis chapter 22, tested Abraham to see what he was made of. When he said, take your son, your only son, the son that you love, if you haven't figured out who I'm talking about, Isaac, and sacrifice him. He tested Abraham. The challenge is that the same word in the New Testament is used for both temptations and testing. And so it depends upon the source. It depends upon the purpose of what is being put forward for us to identify it as whether it is a temptation or whether it is a test. And although we oftentimes label these as the temptations of Jesus, I really think they were tests. I think they were tests. They were tests of Jesus to discover what kind of Messiah was he going to be. Luke makes it perfectly clear. Mark was last year. Luke makes it perfectly clear that Jesus is identified as the Son of God or the Holy One of God. He has said it about 4 or 5 times up to this point in his gospel. He's identified Jesus as being the Son of God. And now the question is, how is Jesus going to live out his life? How is he going to live out being the Son of God / being the Messiah in this world? And that's what the decisions that are being put forward, that's part of the challenge or the testing that is being laid before him. Is he going to be a Messiah that just gives people everything that they want in life and become a hero that they follow because he's a good guy? Is he going to compromise and just allow people to have a good time on earth? Everything's going to be all right? Is he going to do some somewhat unimportant, unnecessary, spectacular things? And some sleight of hand tricks, and people say, wow, what an amazing guy this is. I want to hang around and see what else he's going to do. Or is it going to be something else? But that's for Jesus. What kind of way was he going to live his life as a son of God? But each one of us, the Bible makes it clear that each one of us are also called to live as a son, daughter, child of God. And there is a significant question about how are we going to live our lives as a child of God. And so this morning we're going to look at the temptations or testing of Jesus as really a testing of us as well as to how we're going to live our lives as a child of God. What are going to be some of the important principles or faith issues that we live by that will make all the difference in the world about how we live now and what the ultimate outcome will be? The first temptation that Jesus faced was the turning of stones into bread. Stones into bread. Luke tells us that Jesus was driven by the Spirit, so God was involved in setting up this experience. He was in the wilderness for 40 days. He was alone. He ate nothing. He was hungry. The wilderness is not a wilderness like we oftentimes think of a wilderness as being, the north woods or a mountain. The wilderness of Judea is a very barren, dry, sandy, gravelly place. There may be steep mountains and hills. The wilderness goes from the highlands of Judea and makes its way down to the depths along the Dead Sea. It was a place filled with stones and rocks, many of which were just about the right size to look like a loaf of bread. And Satan came to Jesus and he said, when he knew that Jesus was hungry, when he knew that Jesus had a need in his life, and he said, well, why don't you just turn some of these stones into bread? Surely you can do that if you're the Son of God. It's not beyond the realm of impossibility for the Creator, the co-creator of the universe, to turn stones into bread. And Jesus responded, quoting from a time when the children of Israel were in the wilderness themselves for 40 years. He quoted Deuteronomy when he said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone. Man shall not live by bread alone." What kind of Messiah was he going to be? Was he going to be the kind of Messiah who solely relied upon his ability to meet the physical needs, the physical wants and desires of people? Or did Jesus know that there was something far superior to that? Now, physical needs are important. Physical needs are significant. And the Bible makes it perfectly clear that we can depend upon God, who clothes the lilies of the field and feeds the birds of the air. We can depend upon God to clothe and feed us. We are invited to ask and to seek and to knock. And the Father loves to give good gifts. But at the same time, we also know that the time is going to come when this earthly tent in which we live in wears out, and it gets folded up and put away, and we look forward to an eternal dwelling place with God in the heavens. What's going to be more important as we walk our way through life? What's going to be more important in our spiritual lives? God providing for our physical needs, our physical desires, or are we going to depend more fully on the spiritual enlightenment and the spiritual comfort that God can give to us? The physical is important, but so many times when people fail to receive everything that they ask or demand of God, it becomes a sore point. It can become a sticky point. It becomes a point that tempts us to abandon God. And so I oftentimes say the grace of God is sufficient. The grace of God supplies our physical needs, but more importantly, the grace of God is there to supply our spiritual needs as well. We don't just live physically. That's not primary in God's sight. The spiritual is infinitely more important. And that's a decision that we've got to decide, we've got to make to guide our living. What's the most important thing for me? The most important thing, not that either one is not important, but what's the most important thing? Physical bread, my physical life, or spiritual bread and my spiritual life? It makes all the difference which one you choose in deciding how you're going to live as a child of God. The second temptation that the devil puts to Jesus is he leads him up to a high mountain. Now, it's literally impossible for there to be any mountain that you can climb up on and see all the kingdoms of the world at one point in time. So this is a figurative language. And I was thinking that many of the temptations that we have really are not necessarily things that are physically right there before us. Oftentimes there are things that are going on in our minds. It's no different with Jesus. But Satan, or the devil, takes him up to a high mountain, shows him all of the kingdoms of the world, and he says, I will give you all of their authority and all of their splendor if you will bow down and worship me. And Jesus says, it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Worship the Lord your God and serve him. Satan says, I'm going to give you authority over all of this. Satan indeed has authority. The New Testament in multiple places, at least 5 or 7 places in the Gospel of John and in the book of Revelation, a couple of other places, describes Satan or the devil as being the prince of this world. He's in charge of this world. He rules over this world. But it's a limited domain. It's limited in scope. It's limited in what he's allowed to do, and it's definitely limited in its span, how long it's going to endure. It's a limited sovereignty, and his defeat is assured. Christ came to defeat, to destroy Satan. And when Jesus returns, he's going to rule over it all anyhow. So the question is, which one will it be? Will we go for the immediate, or will we go for the long term? Will we go for immediate gratification of our desires? And Satan says, I can certainly supply right now what you're looking for, that you believe will make you happy. Or we may delay gratification and say, well, I'm going to look at it in the long term. I'm not going to, in the short term, put Satan on the throne of my life. I'm going to go for the long term and put Jesus on the throne of my life. Who am I going to worship? Who we worship, who we serve, who sits on the throne of our life has something to say about whether we're in it for immediately having our desires gratified or whether we're willing to delay our gratifications and look at it in the long haul, in the long term. The third temptation that came to Jesus and the third decision that we have to make involves Satan taking Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple. Now, there's been much discussion about exactly where is this. The most readily, the most often identified point is on the southeast corner of the Temple Mound area. It overlooks the Kidron Valley that drops down to the east. It's basically the highest point that I've ever seen or seen a picture of. And Satan says, "Isn't it written?" He chooses to quote Scripture, although inappropriately, imperfectly, and says, "Isn't it written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully? And they will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against the stone." Go ahead, jump off and see what happens. Let everybody see what happens right here in Jerusalem. And the people are going to go, "Wow, I've never seen anybody do anything like that before. I wonder what other kind of magical tricks he can do." And Jesus said, No. Again, quoting Deuteronomy, he says, "It is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Jesus says, we're not supposed to test God. We're supposed to trust God. We're not supposed to say, "God, I challenge you to do this, that, or the other." As we make our way through life as children of God, we are called to simply trust God's wisdom, trust God's love, trust God's power. I like, and I know over my life, I've quoted over and over again, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Many of you probably know it by heart. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." Trust in the Lord with all your heart. The decision is ours to make whether we're going to test God and say, "Well, God, if you come through in this case, then I'm going to continue to rely upon you and continue to follow you," or whether we say, "Yea, even though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." I put my trust in him is our call. Trust God. As we make our way through life, there are many, many, many important tests. That's a picture of the infamous proficiency examinations that our children and grandchildren sit through in their lives today, and they're really important so that you can advance on to the next level in schooling and so that you can graduate with a significant degree. I understand there are various levels of high school diplomas, beginning with a certificate of attendance, I believe you can get. Am I right, Judy? I thought you would know, but... I'm retired. She's retired, all right. I'll understand that in a few months. But proficiency exams. There's eye tests, there's blood tests, there's physical examinations that look at our brains, our hearts, other organs in our bodies. We are tested about our love and about our loyalty for our spouses, for our friends, for our country, for our church. We are tested, our personalities are tested, our honesty, our integrity, our character. We're tested in our performance at work, at home, in industry. But the most important test in life is, how shall we live as children of God? We have choices to make. What's going to be the most important thing in my life? Physical bread or the spiritual bread of life? Physical bread tastes wonderful and it's necessary to keep the body alive, but we're looking to one who keeps the soul and the spirit alive. Which will it be? Immediate gratification by worshiping Satan and giving in to his dominion, or delaying perhaps our earthly gratification for the eternal kingdom of Christ and having him sit on the throne and rule over our lives? Which shall it be? Shall we continually test God and say, if you come through this time, I'm going to continue to follow you, and if you fail, I won't? Or are we simply going to trust God regardless of the outcome, believing that in all things God is going to work for the very best that he can in our lives? Which shall it be? And that's a good question, I think, for us to ask. That's why I actually selected this text for the first Sunday of the new year, is as we enter into this new year as well. What are going to be the guiding principles, the guiding faith principles in my life this year and in the years to come? How shall we live that demonstrates we're truly children of God? Let us choose wisely.